whole week before the conference, but came up, so we know God is really smiling on us. Anyway, I think the reason Michelle doesn't need an introduction is because, in fact, we all have read her biography and her book, so we know what a powerful impact her penetrating analysis of the mass incarceration system as a vestige of the old Jim Crow in new, whitewashed clothes. Michelle has asked us, instead of presenting a prepared address, and I think there was a great wisdom in this, to be interviewed instead. And so we asked two people that we thought would ask equally penetrating and probing questions of Michelle to be our interviewers today. Immediately to my right is Daniel Hunter from Training for Change. Daniel is probably at this moment best known for his book that recently came out, Building a Mass Movement to End the New Jim Crow, which he wrote in conjunction or in consultation with Michelle. He'll be with us this morning asking questions, and again this evening to help ask questions of us. Also with us this morning is Jondhi Harrell, and he is a returning citizen, and he is also, in my estimation, has had some penetrating analysis of the situation that he has experienced from the inside and what the difficulties with reentry have presented, have been challenges to which he is rising with his organization, the Returning Citizens Center for Returning Citizens here in Philadelphia. So without further introduction, I turn it over to our very wonderful folks, and thank you so much for being with us.
So we're starting with a little bit of technical difficulties in the morning, but want to just welcome Michelle and thanks for being with us and thanks for the wisdom that you shared. I know that for many of us, Baltimore is on our mind, and many of us are carrying the brothers and sisters who are out in the streets and the brothers and sisters who are in jail in our hearts and as we come in this morning. And one of the things that I think is important for us to keep figuring out is how do we support this movement to develop more strategic thinking as well as expression of emotion. And that, I mean, this is being called a riot and is many things and is disciplined protest alongside people who are angry. And so one thing I'm curious about is how do you see the expression of emotion via the anger and rage that's in the streets of Baltimore? And how do you see strategy in terms of developing disciplined campaigns to move this massive institution of mass incarceration? How do you see those two sitting hand in hand together?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. That really is the question I think everyone is wrestling with right now. And I just want to first say thank you so much for inviting me here to be with you as you all are working through these questions and trying to figure out what it means to build a truly transformative movement to end mass incarceration. And, you know, I think like everybody in this room, I've been heartbroken over what I've seen happen not only to Freddie Gray, but much of what has followed. And I've also been hugely inspired, you know, by the thousands of people who have taken to the streets and inspired by many of the young people who really were willing to be completely honest about how they feel and their own rage and pain. And although they may not have expressed it always in ways that, you know, the streets in recent days. Last night, there was on the New York Times website an article that was posted. Many of you may have seen it already. I actually posted it to Facebook last night called "We Are All Freddie Gray Now." Yeah. And I was surprised that the New York Times ran the piece because it was written by a man who is actually arguing for violence. He basically made the case that, as someone who'd grown up in Baltimore and knew all too well the brutality of the police and had been a victim of it, and members of his family had been victims of it over and over again, that he and many, many other young people are looking at the protests that have occurred around the country, protests that he feels were nonviolent but ultimately yielded little in terms of results, and kind of asking the question, why should we just keep holding hands with pastors and marching in the streets when nothing ever seems to change? And we just go home, and then weeks later or days later, there's another killing, another tragedy. Isn't it time now for us just to say to the elected leaders in Baltimore, do the right thing and stop protecting the police, or we're going to burn this city down? And I was grateful that the Times ran the piece because I think it was such an honest expression of what so many people are feeling, this sense of being tired and feeling like we've been through this over and over again. How many times do we have to take to the streets, be nonviolent, hold hands with the pastors, only to watch it play out over and over again? And my feeling is that this sense that so many people have that we've been trying nonviolence for a long time and it hasn't worked rests on kind of a false conception. The nonviolent strategies and activists that so many people were committed to, really, especially towards the end of King's life, is not what has been going on over the last 40 years. I think it's time for us to have an honest conversation of what it means to build a truly strategic, nonviolent revolution against injustice, as opposed to just we're in the streets again because we're mad about the latest thing that has happened. And those are two very different things. It's necessary for us to take the streets and protest when tragedy occurs. So I don't want to dismiss protest as somehow being unimportant. But we do have to find a way to transition from protest politics, reacting when bad things happening, to really the strategic, difficult work of how do we build a truly nonviolent revolution that ends not just to end mass incarceration or cut our prison population by half, which is the stated goal of many, but ultimately a revolution that will break this nation's habit of creating these massive systems of racial and social control. Right now, I think we're in a very different place than we were 5 years ago. When my book was first released, nobody wanted to talk about any of this stuff. Obama had just been elected. We were in a Washington Post racialism, and we have overcome and all of that. But there have been a number of developments, including especially the uprising in Ferguson, which I think we really are going to have to look back at as a turning point for this movement as a whole. But also, over the last 5 years, we've had politicians across the political spectrum now coming together saying, oh, maybe it's time to rethink this massive prison state we've created because we don't want to raise taxes on the predominantly white middle class. And so there's this moment where suddenly, Hillary Clinton now is portraying herself as, a champion of the movement to end mass incarceration when it was the Clinton administration that was a primary architect of, the current system of racial and social control. So we're at this critically important moment now where people are awake and they're angry, and there is a space politically for a meaningful conversation about what's necessary. But I think that we have got to move out of the space of just analyzing a problem. And we have to analyze it and understand it in order to respond, effectively to it. But we have to, I think, begin to have the hard conversations of, all right, if we're going to build, a radical movement that has the hope and promise of dismantling the system and birthing something new, what do we need to do it? What needs to happen, in our places of worship? What needs to happen in communities? What needs to happen in prisons? What needs to happen in street corners? What needs to happen in our schools? And what infrastructure needs to be created? One of the frustrations that I've had is I've gone all over the country speaking, in all kinds of, arenas. I've been speaking in prisons, speaking in juvenile detention, speaking in churches, speaking at judicial conferences, speaking all these different places. And everywhere I go, people say, what do I do? I want to join the movement, but what do I do? And, right now, there is not a single national organization, not a single national organization that has deep grassroots connections to local communities that is focused like a laser on ending mass incarceration in America. Not one. So when people say, I want to join the movement, they often have no idea even what's going on in their own community to address it. There's incredible work going on in communities all over the country, incredible work going on in Philadelphia, incredible work going all over, but people lack awareness of what's happening. It often feels disconnected, and there is no infrastructure for this. There's membership-based organizations that are focused on ending the criminalization and disposal of generations of poor communities and communities of color. People don't know how to connect and to join, and I don't think we just simply have to replicate what was done in the 60s. We're in a new time, new era, new tools, new technology. It's a new era, but we still face many of the same questions, which is how do we actually build a movement that has revolutionary capacity and potential as opposed to just getting out and protesting.
President Obama recently called the protesters and the rioters in Baltimore thugs and criminals. I was very disappointed to hear that language because I expected more from him. This is typical of the thinking that the administration of not just our national leaders but our local leaders show. I was recently invited to a community policing meeting with the mayor of Philadelphia and the commissioners and various organizations. And when it came to speak, I looked around and said, you got the wrong people in this room. Because it was so many pastors and activists and community organizations who the young people do not listen to. So one question is, how do we connect the real voices in the community? I'll give you an example. We had a meeting at the Friends Center 2 weeks ago where we had a political forum where we brought mayoral candidates to come out to speak. Across the hall we had the Black Lives Matter people, and they would not walk across the room to talk to those politicians. That's how do we make that connection?
First, I share your deep disappointment with the use of the term thug by President Obama, by the mayor of Baltimore, by so many folks who have gotten so accustomed to being able to dismiss entire populations just by a label. They're thugs, they're felons, they're criminals, a repeat offender, a gangbanger. These labels are meant to kind of trigger a mental switch in our brains so that we stop hearing, stop listening, and allow law enforcement just do whatever they do and give them a wide berth to do it. And so I think we have to be very conscious that we don't in any way use language ourselves that has that same effect. In my book, I wrote it, I started working on it 7 years ago. I use the term ex-offender. Throughout the book, there's the term ex-offender. That is not language I would use today in writing a book. And I think in so many ways, formerly incarcerated people and their families have done such an enormous service to the movement by challenging even those of us who think we're standing in solidarity about our language, about the way we talk and think and frame the very issues that we're, that we're engaged in. So that's, I think, critically important. But, you know, in terms of trying to get young people and political leaders in the same room and connected, I have very mixed feelings about it. I think young people are entitled to their distrust. And I don't necessarily think that the answer is simply for young people and the prevailing kind of political establishment to sit down and kind of work their issues out, or for everyone to feel heard. I'm always for dialogue and trying to get increased understanding, but I think that there are often attempts by politicians and others to say, well, we want to talk to young people and hear from them, but there is almost sort of a co-optation that takes place of young people's anger and resentment, and rather than really giving young people a role or voice or some power, they feel as well, as long as they feel heard, then perhaps I can keep going on with the work that we're doing in business as usual. I take a look at what's happening in Baltimore as well as what the Democratic Party has been doing for the last few decades, and I say, why would I, as a young person, trust the current Democratic establishment to hear me, to take my concerns seriously? I'm for dialogue, but I also think that perhaps the time has come, maybe it's overdue, for young people and others to think seriously about building alternatives to the current political parties and building power and strength outside of the political machines that now run cities like Baltimore.
What would that look like?
Well, you know, I certainly don't have a blueprint for it, and I think that, you know, many of the young people and others, and I don't want to say just young people because I've talked to pastors, I've talked to a lot of folks who are tired of business as usual, old folks, veterans from previous movements who are willing to become serious about developing alternatives. But, you know, I think that we ought to explore in more serious ways than we have in the past, building alternative parties. You know, it seems too challenging and pie in the sky when you think about, well, you can't run a presidential candidate isn't a Democrat or Republican, billions of dollars to do so. On a local level, it's possible for people and communities to begin to organize, to take over school boards and city councils and begin to build power outside of the prevailing machine. And I think it's something that needs to be explored, and too often we wag our fingers and shame people in poor communities of color, young people, for not getting out to vote. You know, we say, oh, well, you can't complain if you don't get out to vote. And then they look at who's running and who's running the political machine, and they say, why should I support this? And so I think, you know, one thing we need to consider is building real alternatives, so that we're not asking people simply to go meet with their legislator or to sign a petition or to support yet another Democrat who is hooked into the larger machine.
That briefly, in Philadelphia, we pioneered the term return citizens as a label that is positive for those who had that experience of mass incarceration. We also started what we call the Block Party. It stands for Build, Lobby, Organize, Campaign, to bring together Democrats, Republicans, Green Party, whatever you are, to come together and really build a community. But it's been extremely difficult to inspire people to come out and support it, returning citizens, because they've been so damaged by the system. They have no faith. And ordinary people who think, well, that's returning citizens. You know, they've been in jail and they're trying to do something for them, but they aren't looking at the greater community. Our concerns are the same concerns of the greater community. And like in this election, we have had all candidates come to our forums, speak to us, and we're going to support a Republican candidate, a Green Party candidate, one candidate from the Free Dominion Party, who we never heard of. But he came out, he did a wonderful presentation, and he's in opposition to a Democratic city council person who has never done anything for us in our district. So you have to look at alternatives. So perhaps that's what you're speaking on in terms of bringing those elements together.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And, you know, I find one of the most promising, encouraging developments of the past several years is the growing movement of returning citizens, formerly incarcerated people who not only have managed to survive, given all of the obstacles that are facing them, but are finding their voice and beginning to organize others for the restoration of their basic civil and human rights, and who are helping to build this broader movement and contribute in the ways, you know, that you described. And I think it's incumbent on us to support those efforts, you know, rather than just sitting back and saying, oh, what can I do? Well, many of these organizations are struggling financially. Yes. Many of these organizations are being run on shoestring budgets, where they're not only trying to organize for, you know, restoration of voting rights or ban the box, or, you know, the list goes on, but are also trying to help people who have been formerly incarcerated just get a job or a roof over their head. And there's no resources available to support this kind of work. And so I think one of the things that we can do is to financially support the excellent work that is already occurring in these communities. And, you know, it's not always easy figuring out who's doing what in a community, but that's part of the work. It's figuring out what is the good work that is being done that is desperately in need of our financial support, of our labor, of our volunteer resources, of our physical space, you know, that we can open these organizations, open our doors up to for these organizations and support the great work that's already occurring.
In a way, one of the things you're talking about is how do people who are how do people follow and build relationships with a community that has been deeply othered, deeply isolated, and that one of the things, and here I'm talking a little bit to Quakers, can be a challenge to follow. Quakers often like to create their own. Pardon some of y'all. And so I'm curious if you have one or two examples. I know picking examples is always tricky because then it looks like you're holding one over another, but just one or two examples of folks and groups who have been able to model a kind of accompaniment with, sort of following, working with returning citizens, rather than a model of we go off and create our own organization and then we come in coalition together. But ones where we have, and that go deeper than just sort of financial support.
Well, actually, let me ask you that question. You have, and please share a little bit about the book that you've written. Yes. It's really important because, you know, what Daniel has done is do quite a bit of research about the organizing work that is going on around the country to really build a movement to end mass incarceration, and has focused a lot on the work of returning citizens and the courageous work they're doing. And so I'm curious what you've been most impressed by as you've taken a look at it.
I mean, the one example that comes to my mind is a group that was originally called Silicon Debug. And they were called that because they realized, sort of it's a cute name, but they realized Silicon had a problem, which is all of these workers who weren't the high-paid tech industry, but the folks who did janitorial work, cleaned offices, folks who just did manual labor, and were paid incredibly low wages. And Silicon Debug began mostly as a sort of organizing effort to sort of have people get in a room together and talk about what some of their problems were. And they began to hear stories over and over again of returning citizens struggling, people who were getting arrested under extraordinarily questionable circumstances, bogus. And their intention originally had just been to create an organization almost like a union of these folks. And what they began to do is realize we need to get in a deeper relationship because our intention of just supporting this way that we're coming at it is actually getting in our way. So we have to follow the needs of the people that we're working with. And the needs of the people largely had to butt up against the system of mass incarceration, particularly at the form of policing and at the form of length of incarceration. Those were the two sort of pieces that they identified. And so part of what they did was they did the work that organizers do, which is build a base of people who are connecting with others and bringing in people who weren't returning citizens, but bringing in folks who had resources to connect with lawyers, etc. But I think the additional piece was they moved it away from just a service model, which is a temptation. And instead, when someone was serviced, given help, they then made it, not a requirement, but made the ask, your job is to now go help others. And you understand how to navigate the system because you have expertise in this area. And so they would then bring people back into the organization rather than the service model, which is we help somebody and then they go off. And not recognize that they actually have expertise that we don't have. And so that integration built up more people, more numbers. It gave them a chance to get politically challenged. Their leadership got questioned, and they began to also expand their political analysis that way. So I think that would be one that comes to my mind around that.
Yes.
Nice. Some definite ideas on the subject. I mean, I like to advance. In Philadelphia, we have a lot of very vibrant organizations that are doing the real work in the community. And the problem is that they are not funded by the city or the state. They aren't recognized for the work, and they aren't funded by those who should be funding them. Many people in this room, many people in various religious organizations who have read your book, who are on mass incarceration committees, ask, what can we do to push forward the movement? What you can do is you can support the organizations that are doing the real work of the movement. And don't act like we're not easy to identify. We are there. Go into the community and ask who's doing what. If you go into Philadelphia and you ask a returning citizen, where can you find a job at? He's not going to tell you RISE. He's going to tell you TCRC. If you ask the prisoner who helps us when we're violated, they'll say Human Rights Coalition. They'll say Incarcerate PA. If you're a young person and you come out of prison, you go to YAS, the Youth Arts Self-Empowerment Program. There are so many organizations with dedicated people. We created CAMI, the Coalition Against Mass Incarceration, out of the Unitarians having a teach-in on mass incarceration. I was invited to that and invited to the planning stages. My response was, listen, this is a day where I come to your church and, no disrespect, a bunch of white people talk about mass incarceration, have some food, and go home feeling good about themselves. Count me out. I don't have time for that. But if you want to bring your resources together and create something lasting, I will help you do that. So for 6 months after that, Marietta, Nancy, some wonderful people at the Unitarian Church formed this teaching. Brought a lot of folks together, and out of that, they created breakout groups. All had an assignment to attack mass incarceration on a certain level. From that came CAMI, and it's an ongoing organization that is moving. They recently lobbied the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, which is 1,300 churches, to financially support them. If 1,300 churches gave $100 a month, then you have finances to move things forward. This is what we have to do. We have to go out in the community and say, this is what we need. Stop playing with us. This is the reality. Support us.
I think that's such an excellent point. You know, one of the challenges, I had a wonderful conversation with a few folks at breakfast. I don't see where they are now, but there you go. All right. Yes, I had a wonderful dialogue. One of the things that came up was that many nonprofit organizations are sort of held hostage by their funders in the sense that they have to frame their work and spin their message and define what they're up to in a way that will please their funders, and they have to report about the nature of their work and meet certain targets in a way that will please funders, and that for those organizations that really want to be about more radical change, it can be very difficult to figure out, well, how are we going to pay staff? How are we going to keep our doors open? And certainly one of the things that faith communities in particular can do is to help fund organizations that would not otherwise get funded, or help to ensure that they have a certain baseline of stability so they don't have to worry about whether you know, certain foundations are going to cut the cord or not. And you know, I think very often we forget how much power we have in terms of our voices and our labor, but also how much money exists within progressive and radical circles to fund and support the kind of organizing and advocacy that really needs to occur. So I just want to echo what you shared. It seems to me that, you know, at this moment, we have a critical need for organizations that essentially build, you know, I like to call the Underground Railroad, you know, yes. Organizations that are helping, you know, to ensure that those who are coming out of the system or who are being targeted by these who are living under occupation, helping folks to survive and have a genuine shot of real freedom, making it out alive in the era of mass incarceration. And so we need these, you know, organizations and individuals that are actually just providing that critical level of support that's necessary. I love Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, and one of the points he makes is that it is critically important to meet the basic needs of survival for people before you have any expectations of them being engaged in a serious way in the movement. You can't look and say, oh, well, why aren't, you know, more people rising up if the system is so bad? Well, they're trying to survive, right? They're trying to feed their kids, keep a roof over their heads. We've got to have a commitment to meet the basic survival needs of people if we're going to be serious about building this movement. So there's that work that needs to be done. I find that some faith communities sort of stop there with a charity model of the work, right? So that work is necessary, but then there also has to be the work for abolition of the system as a whole. And that work of abolition is, you know, often the work that, you know, when we're open and explicit about it, some of the kind of traditional funders begin to get squeamish about and back away from. And there's a critically important role, I think, for funders and people of means to support that kind of work as well.
Can I push on the Underground Railroad metaphor just for a second? So it's one Quakers love to reference, and so I'm thinking about, so there's a group, New Sanctuary Movement here in Philadelphia, and they are specifically working with undocumented immigrants who are increasingly one of the major areas of mass incarceration, which is the growth rate, as more and more people are getting detained and then thrown out of the country. And so one of the things that they have begun doing is creating, out of their namesake of sanctuary, providing sanctuary to immigrants, undocumented immigrants, who are threatened with being final exporting orders, so given their final deportation orders. So in Philadelphia this has happened, and they were able to get, through public pressure, a woman who was held for, I think, 3 months, might have been the period of time, held 3 months in a church. and were able to get her final deportation order revoked. That's a different model than the charity model of the Underground Railroad. And the way you just sort of described the Underground Railroad and sort of linked it closely to charity, I just want us to tease out, which is the Underground Railroad wasn't just survival, it was survival with sacrifice. And where is the sacrifice? Where are the places, where are the folks who you see modeling, doing that charity in a way that's sacrificial versus simply beneficial to myself?
And if I could segue onto that, we have to look back in history and realize that the Underground Railroad was not just a vehicle for slaves to come to the North. Once they came to the North, they had to create a new life. Right. They had to build a infrastructure to move forward into the future. Right. So when we look at mass incarceration, once a person comes out of that system, they have to build an infrastructure. And this is where organizations, churches, activists who are serious about mass incarceration can focus. It's on the community level. What happens to a person who's done 10, 15 years when they come out? What has been happening to the children of incarcerated parents, which we really don't talk about? This is a side of mass incarceration that really has to have more focus. When I was incarcerated, I had a wonderful family who stepped in and basically raised my kids for 18 years while I was incarcerated. What about the families that don't have that? What about the kids who are in DHS? We have children in our after-school drop-in program whose father is doing life in prison. That is a daunting challenge for a 10-year-old boy who will never walk with his father under a tree or have the normal relations that we take for granted for the rest of his life. What do you put into place so that he can visit his father, build a relationship, and have that sort of male companionship and family arrangement that will turn him into a person who can exist in society in a positive manner and not be so hardened and close to the system that he's one of the kids out there burning down buildings simply because he feels there's no hope and his whole life has reflected.
Yes. You know, I think one of the most important challenges he faces in treating the folks who have been labeled the felons or the criminals or even the children who are dealing with folks who are, with loved ones who are behind bars is asking ourselves, what is the level of care, compassion, and concern that folks deserve and that we can model? It's one thing to say the system shouldn't be so punitive, the system should show care and concern. It's another question to say, what does it mean for me to show care? What does it mean for my community to show care and concern? What does it mean for my faith group to show care and concern? And to be very concrete about what that looks like in terms of funding, in terms of volunteer support, in terms of the time that's spent, that's in terms of what is said publicly, what all of that, I think, is a very different kind of conversation. It moves us away from just analyzing the problem to being very specific about what does it mean for me individually and our group collectively to do what we think our government ought to be doing. If we believe our government should be acting with more care and concern, how does it look for us to demonstrate that in the lives of individuals? And there's countless ways that we can do it. And I think one of the great things about Daniel's book is that he identifies the fact that there is no one role for people to play, that everyone is going to have different skills, talents, abilities, passions that they can bring to the movement. And it's about figuring out what is the unique contribution that you individually or your group or organization can make to this. There's going to be a role for artists. There's going to be a role for healthcare workers. There's going to be a role for people who are psychologists to provide mental health support. There's going to be a role for all of us in figuring out what can we do concretely. You know, I think for me, as someone who is a writer, I'm constantly challenging myself, all right, how can my writing be of use? How can it serve the movement? And we all have something to contribute. and very often I think it's easy for us to sit back and go, well, what can I do? Rather than being really honest about the skills, interests, capacities that we have, and that there are opportunities right in our own local communities to apply them in a way that will be meaningful and valuable.
If I shift the conversation a little bit. In Pennsylvania, our misguided legislators in Harrisburg passed the Re-Victimization Relief Act, which we call the Silencing Act. And while this was purported to silence Abu Jamal, it was very wide-ranging, and it could have affected community activists both inside the prison and here in the community. Now, on Tuesday, April 28th, the District Judge, Christopher Connor, struck down the law. He found that it was too broad, too vague, and it blatantly violates free speech protections. What are your thoughts about this law, on legislation like this and this decision?
I assume everyone here is familiar. No? Okay. Well, this law was actually passed here in Pennsylvania in response to an announcement. What was the college, the university?
Goddard.
Goddard College.
Okay, Goddard had invited Mumia to deliver effectively a commencement address to students. Obviously, he couldn't. I'm sorry?
Does everybody know who Mumia is? Yeah, they don't even know. Explain who Mumia is.
We got an educational moment. Go ahead.
Okay. Mumia Abu-Jamal is a political prisoner here in the United States who was convicted of murdering a police officer, and although he was sentenced to death, and was on death row for a very long time, where he wrote a number of books that are very powerful, and I would encourage people, if you're not familiar with Mumia's work, to read his work, which has been hugely influential for people particularly who have been working on prison abolition for a long time. Although there were numerous questions raised about his possible innocence in the years of his incarceration, there has been little receptivity within our judicial system to having another trial or a retrial, although the NAACP Legal Defense Fund did succeed in getting him off death row, where he's now, but he's still incarcerated, facing life in prison, and he's currently very, very ill, stricken with diabetes, and there are a lot of serious questions about whether he is receiving adequate medical health treatment. So, but Mumia, because he has been such a powerful voice and has been influential for many, many young people who have read his work and writing or listened to interviews that he's given on radios, he was asked to give a commencement address at Goddard College. And of course, he couldn't be there in person, but his remarks could be shared with college community there. And police union in Philadelphia, as well as others, were so outraged that Mumia, who was a cop killer, could be given this kind of platform and treated with that kind of respect to be able to address people, that a law was passed in the state legislature barring, making it possible for victims, families, or other concerned citizens to bar someone who is in prison from speaking publicly.
Yes.
And
they actually passed that law.
The law was passed and fortunately was challenged by the ACLU and others, and as just explained, was recently struck down as a violation of free speech. And I was very concerned at the time that the law was passed that there would be copycat legislation. It's already extraordinarily difficult for people who are behind bars to communicate with the media or to share their stories or information about the conditions of their confinement. It's already extremely difficult. And
for a piece of legislation like this, barring any form of communication to the public, those behind bars at the request of a victim's family or a group that feels aggrieved, was a blatant violation of the First Amendment, but also I think was at risk of setting a very troubling precedent.
And just as a matter of education for those who aren't familiar with the law, as adopted by the legislator, the law was aimed at barring those convicted of, and in some cases accused of, crimes from speaking or acting in ways that would re-traumatize their victims. The measure granted crime victims or prosecutors acting on their behalf the right to seek injunctive relief in court to stop any conduct by an offender or former inmate that perpetuates a crime's effect on the victim. What that would mean is, in my case, just take me for example, I was a former bank robber. Now I'm a community activist. If a bank teller from 25 years ago said, "Oh, I remember him, he traumatized me. He has no right to speak on anything," they could go to a court and effectively stop all my work. Those who are inside, you have so many community activists who are inside, teaching, sending their work out. That would have stopped all their work. Although this was aimed at stopping Mumia's voice, it was wide-ranging and could have affected hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, I just want to say this was something we talked a little bit about this morning too in our little breakfast group as well, which is that, my view is that there's no hope of ending the system of mass incarceration if we don't come to care about those who've been demonized and treated as disposable. And there's no way that we, the people, will ever come to care about them if we never hear from them. So the last 40 years, we hear from the politicians about crime and the criminals and the felons. We hear from law enforcement officials about them. There's media caricatures and portrayals, Hollywood depictions of who the criminals are and the felons. But we almost never hear from them, the people who have been labeled and branded and demonized. But until we do, it's easy for us to believe the worst possible things about them and imagine that their lives aren't worth affording basic dignity and respect. And so, I don't know how many saw the video I posted on Facebook and that was circulated widely on social media of, gang members in Baltimore who came together to say, no, we did not call truce in order to, engage in some grand conspiracy to kill the police. We came together because we want our communities to thrive. We're here because we're marching for justice for Freddie Gray. And watching these gang members speak so eloquently and passionately and with such sincerity about their love for their community, for their commitment to standing united, was really remarkable, because we so rarely get to hear from the people who we think of as criminals or gangbangers. And at the end of the interview, the newscaster said, well, that's a different perspective that we've heard.
But here's the reality. That's a different perspective, but that perspective is a real perspective that we just don't acknowledge.
Right.
I was blessed in my incarceration to be under the mentorship of Dr. Matul Shakur, who is a political prisoner and a wonderful freedom fighter, and he formed a circle of consciousness in every prison that he was in. And I spent 12 years working with him, and we literally trained hundreds of young men to go back in society and do the same work. Many of them gang members. Now, we never tried to get them to leave their set because that's their family. Right. People in society don't understand that. Yeah. You see gangs and you're looking at, he's a Crip, blood, gangster's disciple, as if it's something evil. It's a subculture, it's a family, it's a community. And they are some of the most articulate, intelligent brothers you ever want to meet. And they control certain areas of the community. The reality is, if communities want to reduce the violence, they want to have the community function better, you have to deal with the elements in the community who hold the real power, who hold the respect, and who are listened to by the young people in the community. And until we get to the point where we're willing to deal with them on a real level, on a respectful level, and say, this is what we have, these are the resources that we bring. How can we help you to work inside your community? Then you will begin to see real change. And that's the reality.
Yeah. So turning again, I want to ask about, I mean, you were mentioning that one of the things Quakers love to do is create policy.
Yes.
And one of the real concerns, I think, for many of us, for example, out of Baltimore, out of Ferguson, have been calls for what I consider very cheap reforms. So calls that would result in, for example, body cameras has been one that has regularly gotten attention. But also there's been other calls for, well, what we need to do is we just need to invest in more training for the police so that they can do their job better, under an assumption that they're not doing their job. And I would love it if you would speak a little bit about what are some of the cheap reforms that are out there, and how do you encourage people to get beyond the cheap reforms so that they can get to what you're calling the transformational movement, the revolutionary movement.
Yeah, you know, I've been a critic of police body cameras as being sort of a seductive, easy answer to the problem of police violence for a number of reasons. One is that those body cameras don't actually film the police, they film everyone they come in contact with. So from my perspective, police body cameras is a way of placing poor communities of color under even greater surveillance. So as they're walking down the street in every interaction, they're videotaping who they come into contact with and who's doing what. It's not the police who are being videotaped, it's the people they come into contact with. And you know, I also think that there's a temptation to imagine that there's a technological solution to the problem of police officers being at war with the communities that they're paid to serve. And so I have resisted those kinds of solutions, even though it's undeniable that, you know, Walter Scott, killer, would not be facing charges today if it hadn't been that someone had captured that incident on videotape. So there's no doubt that the capacity for ordinary people to videotape what police are actually doing really has blown open the public debate about police conduct in ways that, you know, wasn't possible before we had smartphones. So I think technology can be a tool, but I think the temptation to be seduced into imagining that it's going to solve these problems in a meaningful way really has to be resisted. I think really the question gets to, what are we really after here? When we say that we want to end mass incarceration or we want to transform police departments, what are we really talking about? And very often people say, well, we need to hire more black police officers, which clearly, if you've been to Baltimore, is not the answer, or Philly, right? We need to engage in more training, and as you pointed out in your question, that rests on an assumption that somehow police aren't actually doing the job that we have assigned to them during a time where we're asking them to wage a literal war on poor communities of color. And so I think we really are going to have to risk sounding unreasonable in our demands, you know, and I think as someone who's been trained as a lawyer and has worked as a forensic, been a difficult transition for me to make, because, you know, as a lawyer, you're trained to make demands and frame what you want in a way that is likely to be received well by a judge or by the majority of the population you're speaking to. But I think we're in a place right now where we have to begin to demand things that right now seem like they're not likely to be possible. One of those things is demilitarizing the police and transitioning to, you know, peace officers. We no longer want warriors in our communities. We want peace officers. You know, in Britain, police don't even carry guns, even though the violent crime rate in Britain rivals our own. You know, there's questions about whether they track violent crime in the same way or report it in the same way that we do. But if there's differences in terms of the violent crime rate, they're not severe. They're not dramatic. And yet they have a philosophy there that unless there's a standoff kind of situation where there absolutely needs to be lethal force brought to the scene, police officers do not, in their routine encounters with the public, you know, carry firearms. The understanding is that they're there to diffuse situations and keep the peace rather than to escalate them or to use force and violence. And so I find that when I talk to people today about, well, should police even be carrying guns? People go, are you crazy? You know, of course the police. So many aspects of the way law enforcement operate in our country today have become so normalized in our consciousness that it just seems unthinkable that our police wouldn't be militarized, that we wouldn't have SWAT teams, you know, executing routine drug warrants. But I think really challenging people in ways that make them uncomfortable and encouraging them to imagine that there's another way is really important. I also believe that we need to talk seriously about ending the drug war for real. That means not just legalizing marijuana. It means decriminalizing, from my perspective, decriminalizing the simple possession of all drugs across the board and embracing a model more like Portugal. You know, in Portugal, they decriminalized all drugs across the board, heroin, crack, you name it. If you're caught with possession of a small amount of drugs in Portugal, you are not going to be put in a cage. You are not going to be stripped of your basic civil and human rights. You may be, you know, responded to as though you have a potential health problem. You will be given access to drug treatment and support, but you are not going to be labeled a criminal and stripped of your basic civil and human rights. And after 10 years of Portugal decriminalizing the simple possession of all drugs across the board, the rate of drug addiction and drug abuse declined. The numbers of people who were seeking drug treatment, you know, rose as it was less stigmatized and people were less afraid of admitting their problems with drug addiction and drug abuse. And they've reinvested the money that was once spent caging people into drug treatment and drug prevention. And so, you know, I think we have got to say, we want the police to stop enforcing, you know, these simple, you know, drug laws. We can demand that. The logs are on the book, but we can say we no longer want the police arresting people for these minor drug offenses or using drugs as an excuse to stop, frisk, chase people who are viewed as potential drug offenders. We want an end to that. But just ending it isn't enough. And I guess for me, this is another critically important piece of the work that gets overlooked, particularly in this kind of era where, you know, we have bipartisan criminal justice reform on the table, which is that it's not enough simply to stop doing the bad thing. It's not enough to say, okay, well, we're going to stop locking people up who are caught with marijuana in their pocket. No, we have to be committed to remedying the harm caused by the war that has been waged. We have to be committed to, you know, for me, reparations for the drug war. We have to be committed to investing every single penny that has been saved from not incarcerating people back into the communities that have been harmed the most in the forms of education and economic investment and drug treatment and all the rest. And so, you know, the consensus that's now emerging that maybe we should downsize our prison systems because they cost too much, I think we have to push back and say, oh no, we're going to be spending more money in the years to come. Well, not only are we going to invest every single penny that's been saved back into the communities, but we're going to have to get serious about remedying the harm that's caused. You know, our country has a habit of, you know, creating these vast systems of racial and social control, and then just kind of walking away and asking everyone to move on. So after the Civil War, you know, we say, okay, well, we've ended slavery. Sorry, you know, you're welcome. We're not selling your children anymore. Now move on. But there's no 40 acres and a meal, no, you know, meaningful reparations. Just move on. And then with Jim Crow, you end Jim Crow. We're taking the whites only signs down, but where is the effort to repair the harm that's caused? What we've been offered instead of meaningful reparations or meaningful effort to repair the harm caused is affirmative action. And, you know, I think we have to be honest that affirmative action has benefited a relatively small segment of the community. And when I first heard that South Africa, you know, in the years following, you know, apartheid, were thinking that maybe they should, you know, pursue affirmative action rather than, you know, any kind of reparations for the harms caused. Well, this is, here we go again. This is how people who have power and have benefited the system manage to maintain it while creating this appearance that much more progress is being made. So I think we have to end the wars and the war mentality, but also really build a movement that's about reinvesting in the communities that have been harmed the most.
If I could speak.
Friends, we have one more question from the folks here, and then we're going to open it to questions in the audience. Thank you for the probing questions. One more, and then we'll turn it over to Matt Pilisher, whose film Broken on All Sides many of us saw last night, and he will help harvest some questions from the audience.
Well, you're looking for that. Okay.
When you talk about the effects of white supremacy, and that is the basis of mass incarceration, and it's an $80 billion a year business, mass incarceration. And what you just spoke about was a change in the culture of America. America is a culture built upon oppression, built upon conquest. So to expect that folks who can't even agree on attacking the causes of mass incarceration are going to move toward that sort of thinking, that'd be a great paradigm shift that personally I don't think is anytime in the near future. But my question is, some of my associates and I were discussing, should white supremacy be classified in the DSM as a mental illness, as an affliction, as a disorder? Because it's the basis of mass incarceration and everything else.
Well, I hadn't thought of that.
Please repeat that.
Well, let me use this analogy. Drugs are considered a scourge on society because so many persons' lives have been devastated by drugs. So now we consider drugs and drug addiction, the thought, the action, as a mental disorder, mental illness, a disease. The mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline, police assassinations of unarmed black men, all these are a scourge to American society. So in the name of public safety, should society move to have white supremacy classified in the diagnostic statistical manual as a mental illness or a disease?
Well, I think what the question reveals is how important it is for us to not simply respond to symptoms, but to acknowledge that there is a disease, a real illness, that has to be addressed. And it's a mental illness in many ways, but it's not limited to white folks, right? So I think that when we talk about white supremacy, we have to be clear that we're not just talking about how white folks can imagine themselves to be superior in many ways, but also have to be able to acknowledge the way in which that ideology has really corrupted the identities and ways of thinking and viewing, you know, folks of color in their own communities. How we've internalized much of that. Maybe some of you have heard of the book, The Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, Joe Degree, you know, about which wrestles with some of that, the reality of how white supremacy gets internalized by all of us, and that it is in many ways an illness that has to be, that we have to recover from as a nation. That although we've ended these various systems of slavery, ranging from this basic illness of imagining that some groups of people defined largely by race, that there's just something fundamentally wrong with them. That illness is something that has to be, you know, wrestled with head on. So I think that there is really something to that. And I also think that you're right that what ultimately is needed is a cultural transformation, not simply policy reform. There's a wonderful article that I recommend to you called Bleeding Heart that was written by Tom Stoddard, who is the former director of Lambda in New York. He was the head of Lambda in the 1990s, which for those of you who may not be aware, Lambda is a gay rights organization. And Lambda in the 1990s in New York City was championing a simple anti-discrimination ordinance against gays and lesbians. They were just trying to prevent folks from being fired from their jobs if somehow they were outed, if they were gay or lesbian. And the article is written about how he at that time had been fighting for years and years and years, holding demonstrations and hearings and having people tell their stories of all of the shame and pain and suffering that had been caused unnecessarily by the bigotry and homophobia in New York City directed towards gays and lesbians, and that he was invited to a conference in New Zealand in the 90s, a country that was the only country in the world that had already passed all the laws against discrimination against gays and lesbians that they were fighting for back in New York. He said, I can't wait to get to New Zealand. It's going to be this nirvana for gay and lesbian people. I can't wait to go to this place. And he gets to New Zealand and he's stunned to discover that there was more homophobia in New Zealand and that gays and lesbians were more closeted in New Zealand than they were back home. And he's like, how do you explain this? All the laws have changed here. Everything we're fighting for back in New York has already happened here in New Zealand. How do we explain that things are worse here for gays and lesbians? And what he comes to realize is that the laws had been changed on the books without any public fight, without any movement. The changes in the laws had occurred behind closed doors as part of routine amendments to existing civil rights laws, and there had never been a fight in New Zealand about the dignity and value of people who are gay and lesbian. So people's minds hadn't changed. There had been no cultural transformation. The laws had changed, but people's hearts and minds had not, and the culture remained the same. And he comes back to New York saying, thank God I spent 10 years fighting and losing in New York because we actually won more back home in New York than they achieved in New Zealand. And when we win a change in the laws, it will have reflected a cultural transformation and not simply a shift in laws and policies. And so I think in all of the work that we do and all of the advocacy, rather than just looking for the cheapest, easiest, quickest ways to change a law that's on the books, we need to actually be seeking out the big fights. We actually need to be looking for opportunities to force that public conversation that most of America would rather avoid. And I think we owe such a debt of gratitude to the young people in Ferguson who stood up when Michael Brown got shot down and stayed in the streets and began to force a public conversation that our nation had been content to avoid. And that, I think, helps to fuel the kind of cultural transformation that's necessary if we're going to do more than just tinker with the machine.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask you all to think about what you want to ask or comment to Michelle. I want to thank Jondhi and Daniel for a fabulous interview. My name is Matt Pilisher, and it's my task to try and keep you all to just a couple of seconds, maybe a minute at the most, to get out some comments, some questions. I do want to have as many people be able to participate as possible. So if you're okay with it, Michelle, I'd like to hear from 4 people or so that you could then react to, and then we'll have another handful of people. Does that sound all right? Okay. So great. Hands. I saw you first, so let's have you.
I think in terms of really having this movement move, we need to see some success. We need to be very strategic.
I'm supposed to restate the question for the TV, for the cameras.
Really strategic. And so I'm wondering, in terms of we have all these things holding it up, which piece do you feel is most vulnerable? Like where do we actually show some success? Draw more people into actually
So which piece of the system? Check. Which piece of the system is most vulnerable? Chains break the weakest link. Chains break at the weakest link. So where should we focus our energies? Lynn, I saw your hand.
I'm an ex-offender myself. I was in prison for 2 years, and I understand what it's like as far as fighting a big fight because I am now a lawyer. I'm licensed in D.C., and I am fighting North Carolina right now for my North Carolina for our license. And I was in the Supreme Court last week in North Carolina fighting for that. And I understand what it's like about trying to get little wins and not realizing that it's really not about us. It's about everything. Like trying to set precedent in North Carolina to define what rehabilitation means will open a door for a lot more people that can get through and they don't have to say, this is what it is, this is what we do. And it allows us as ex-offenders to be able to say, hey, that's something I might be able to do. So I guess the question that I'm asking is that the problems that I've been seeing since I've been trying to do this work is trying to get funds and get people to understand how little small steps can make a big deal. For example, getting somebody their driver's license.
Yes.
They don't understand how much they raise up someone's income and be able to make hustles and grind and when they do their own thing. So I have a problem a lot of times trying to find money and things and stuff like that that would help people or get organized in the community.
Can you wrap up, Lynn?
Yes. But my question is, how can we identify and try to get some of these money involved so we can give them back to people that need them to get their driver's license? That's some of the main things I think that could help and work with.
So how do we sort of identify the resources that people, very basic resources that people need coming out, and find the funds and the resources to help them to get those things? Lynn's going to be presenting later in the conference, so you have to go to that. Tyrone in back. Okay, how do we reach people that maybe don't see that there is a problem? And let me just throw it back to you there with that. Okay.
Yeah. They're all very big questions, but first, in terms of the small things that can make a big difference, and I think one of the most important things communities like this to go to organizations that work with formerly incarcerated folks and help to support people who are returning home and ask the questions. what do people most need? What would make the biggest difference? I think there's often a tendency to kind of sit back and try to study it from a distance and that sort of thing, instead of just going to the folks who are most affected and those who are working with the communities most impacted and asking those questions. I think the driver's license example is an excellent one. Many people don't even know that if you have been locked up, you may be stripped of your driver's license for years, and then you're supposed to go find a job and do all of these things, and you can't even get access to a car to get where you need to go. I think actually going to the communities and the organizations that are working most closely on these issues and asking those questions is very important. And as far as kind of what's the weakest link, I think a couple of things. One is, I think we have to be careful to just go after what we think is a quick and easy win, when it may be more important to gear up for a big fight that will help to shift public consciousness in important ways. And that I think very often there's a temptation to want to deliver a win or to prove that we can actually be successful, and that's one of the pressures that often exists when you get funding from a nonprofit organization and you want to show we won this campaign, we did X and Y, when it may be more important to identify goals that will be more difficult to win and only possible to win over a period of years rather than a period of months. That being said, I think one of the easiest targets today is the drug war. Some 70% of Americans think the drug war has been an abysmal failure. We've spent more than 1 trillion years waging it. Rates of drug addiction and drug abuse remain largely unchanged. It's difficult to find a politician who will publicly defend the drug war, and yet it just rages on. And so I think that going after the drug war in its various manifestations is not only an easy target, but as I, spend a lot of time explaining in the book, the drug war really is an important engine of mass incarceration. Most people who are in prison and jail today are not there because of drug offenses, but very often someone's first arrest is for some minor drug offense. And then you're on probation and parole, and then you get violated on probation and parole, and now you're cycling in and out because you're not meeting the terms of your parole or probation. And the evisceration of Fourth Amendment rights as a result of the drug war is part of what makes it easy for the police to chase Freddie Gray and to feel that there will be no repercussions. So I think that there are good reasons to go after the drug war, not the least of which is that it also challenges America to ask themselves the question, how would we respond to people and communities in these, if we actually cared about them? We supposedly criminalize drugs because we're so worried about the harm caused by these substances. We're so worried about what these substances might do to you that we're going to criminalize them. Then we wind up inflicting way more pain and suffering on the very people that we're supposedly so concerned about. And so I think, challenging the drug war and the war mentality that now exists in law enforcement and is reflected in so many of our policies and practices, I think is very important so that we shift from a warlike mentality to a more caring and compassionate one to those who have been most affected. But I would also say that I think that the uprisings that we have seen in response to police violence ought to tell us that police practices in the United States are of such critical importance to young people as well as old folks that that is an area that we protest that force conversations that people would otherwise want to avoid are critically important.
Okay, Marietta.
Never recognize it.
Okay.
I always refer to the Dred Scott decision because I just feel like it's still running around with big strong legs, and that says that white people, black people have no rights that a white person would respect. And I think that when we heard the prosecutor from Ferguson speak, he was saying that. And we don't have to worry, these are black people. And I think we talk about all these other things, but there are people in the United States, black people, who have suffered years of oppression under the mass incarceration system from here to on down. I want to ask you, as I asked you today, what are we going to do about white privilege? Because every time we try to do something, that's what we're going to face. If you say, well, in Pennsylvania, you put the black people in from center of Philadelphia, center city Philadelphia, in prison upstate, and we're not going to give up these prisons because they're our jobs, and it means that we have more political power based on the fact that there are people here. You know, every time we try, when we went to the legislature and we asked, we said, well, we'd like to do something about these guns, not only, in the community, but you say a drug-free school. Why can't we have a gun-free school? We said, don't say anything about guns. That's a non-starter in the legislation. We can't do anything about that. I mean, every time you try to attack something, it's stopped by this whole white privilege, because my wonderful friends in the Unitarian Church love me, but they're not going to give up their white privilege.
Okay. Okay. So, how do we react to keep continually running up against white privilege? Or another question that I would say is, how can we phrase it to say, what do whites have to gain from fighting racism, which is something that I try and talk about a lot. Go ahead, sir.
I have several thoughts, but I'll just ask one question. And one of the things that I found really distressing in reading your book was the continuous growth of the power of the prosecutors once people get into this system.
Yes. Oh my.
It's just horrifying what continued erosion there is of any protections for the people who are being brought into the system. And while we're trying to address the larger issues that we all see here, how can we put a curve on that, reversal of that? It's just, it's such a perversion of a justice system.
Okay, so how do we reverse the extreme power of prosecutors within the system? Let me stay over here, and Joe, go ahead.
A lot of the language people use about race, politicians, others, doesn't match what we know about the way people think. And you do allude to unconscious bias in your book, and how laws allow the exercise of unconscious bias in encounters. And it's something easily measured, reliably measured, that there's a low degree of awareness of. Do you think raising awareness within individuals of their own unconscious bias is actionable, or if there's a role for that in addressing the problem? You see it in the videos of the police, see it over.
Okay, so what is the role of bringing to attention people's unconscious bias and testing for unconscious bias? I'm going to leave it there, and we'll come back for 3 more in a second.
So we've got unconscious bias, white privilege, and what was the first one?
No, white privilege is the first.
Yes, okay. First, as far as prosecutorial discretion and the prosecutorial discretion and the power of prosecutors, I highly recommend a book by Angela Davis, not the Angela Davis of international fame, but a law professor at American University, Angela Davis, who wrote a book called Arbitrary Justice. And in her book, she documents a number of really important reforms that can be made that will help to curb the power of prosecutors. And so I encourage you to kind of take a look at that for kind of action item specific reforms that can be taken to curb the power of prosecutors. But I also would note that, as we were talking at the outset of, how it is possible for us to build kind of alternative political parties and bring pressure to bear on the system from kind of outside of the democratic machine that runs many large cities, that most DAs, are elected. And very often, DAs are elected with relatively little money. These aren't big, well-funded campaigns. They, are kind of identified through the democratic machine and are supported by the right coalition of judges or prosecutors, et cetera, and get the endorsement of the Bar Association. And then on the ballot, they may have a little bit of name recognition, but most people don't even pay attention to who's being elected as a DA. And so there is an opportunity, I think, for communities that want to change the way local prosecutors' offices are being run, to think about identifying their own candidates who ought to be running and really building a grassroots movement to support them. Yes, I think actually I find them quite related, so I'll take them as one. Yeah, unconscious white privilege. Yes. I think we absolutely should be talking both about white privilege and unconscious bias. And, in my book, I don't actually even use the term racism very often, because most people associate racism, that word, with, Bull Connor and the water hoses and the bigots who, are tossing racial slurs left and right. And I think that image, what racism is, helps to kind of absolve white people in their own minds of any responsibility for their own bias, as well as for the forms of structural racism and institutional racism that exist in their society in which they benefit from. And so, I think one of the things we can do, individually, each one of us, is to begin to admit our own biases out loud. To stop just pointing the finger at the police or prosecutors or whoever and saying, well, they're biased and they're racist, but begin to acknowledge we all have racial biases, ethnic biases. Part of what it means to be, a citizen or born and raised in America is to have absorbed by osmosis so much of the illness, the mental illness around race that exists in our culture. And creating spaces where you acknowledge your own bias and biases and stereotypes, even though they may be unconscious, I think helps to create space where people feel less defensive and are more willing to acknowledge their own. And I think the same goes for criminality as a label. I've argued before that I think we should start acknowledging our own criminality. We're all criminals. The criminals aren't them, other people. The criminals are us. We've all broken the law at some point in our lives. We've all done wrong. Only some of us are forced to pay for our mistakes for the rest of our lives and are shamed and stigmatized forever as a label, as a felon or a criminal. And so I think acknowledging our own bias, acknowledging our own criminality, and breaking down the sense that either we're the righteous ones and, you're the criminals or you're the bigots, but acknowledging that we all have complicity and we all have bias, and it's incumbent upon all of us to disavow our privilege and our biases to the best of our ability.
5.
My question to you, my name is 511, and it's on the Incarceration. I also work at the campaign for Crow amongst a slew of other organizations that I won't waste your time with. But my question to you is, how do we get support, mentorship, guidance from our leaders who are so far up here that they're not interacting with those around? We don't need help organizing those previous incarcerated. We've got
tell me who you're referring to. Give me an example. So when you say, how do we reach who? Who are you talking about?
Everyone, including you. Guidance from our leaders, from people who have voices of others, and to prioritize those previously incarcerated. Always last, last in Q&A, last in public comment, or last in city council meetings. So how do we get to shift that paradigm for people previously incarcerated first? To say, let me help those who are helping others who need help, but let me give them my guidance, let me give them my time, let me give them my attention. Rather than giving the ACLU your attention, rather than giving these organizations who already get yearly funding, but to try to put and shift the paradigm, to put the attention of those most directly affected first.
So how do we have the people most impacted at the front of the room? And I think we were very conscious in the organizing of this conference in trying to not just recreate the same sort of expert academic panel at every session. So we've tried to think of that, and that is something that our movement needs to continually think about. Go ahead, sister.
So you mentioned cultural transformation as necessary. I'm a pastor, and many of us in the room, especially with a group of faith perspective. I wonder about spiritual transformation as necessary. I think lots of problematic theology floating around. The saint center, good, bad, dichotomies that are rooted in faith tradition and religious perspective. And so talk a little bit about ways to think around the spiritual transformation necessary to do some of this work.
Okay, what is the spiritual transformation necessary to do some of this work? The brother in the baseball cap. Okay, what about John Legend's new campaign specifically raising the issue of mass incarceration? One more, so the sister in front.
Following up on clergywomen and military leaders as clergywomen, and I started doing the work before your book came out, and the book resonated with so much that I have been encountering. And so what impacted me from the book really was out of chapter 1. Conceptually, we had slavery, we had the old Jim Crow, now we have the new Jim Crow. Unless we have the cultural transformation and the acknowledging of unconscious bias, we will have something else, even if we end the war on drugs and end mass incarceration. So as we do the work with that, what is the recommendation for how the work looks to do the other?
So how do I rephrase that? In this country founded on white supremacism, slavery, ending slavery, transitioning to indentured servitude through the chain gangs, etc., comes Jim Crow. Jim Crow abolished comes mass incarceration. How do we make sure when we end mass incarceration that whatever pops up is not another form of racial and social control?
Very good.
Well, I find all three of these questions to be very much interrelated. I think there is a real danger right now that we're already seeing the seeds planted of what another version of what we got might be. And I was talking this morning about the fact that a lot of the proposals that are being floated right now as part of, this new bipartisan consensus for criminal justice reform revolve around kind of technological monitoring for people who, we think of as criminals. And so rather than putting someone in prison for, 5 years, you can put a GPS monitor on them for 15, and it'll cost you way less. Or rather than locking someone in an expensive literal cage, you can install video cameras in their homes or in their apartments and have them watched and have them tracked with GPS. And so this is cheaper, and it'll save us a lot of money, and oh, you're free, you're out, right? But you're locked in a virtual cage, or what Jazz Hayden calls open air prisons, where you're still trapped in this caste-like system. And so we may reduce the prison population dramatically, and yet you still have populations who are under perpetual correctional control or second-class citizens. And so ultimately we have to change our consciousness. You can't just change the policy. We don't change the consciousness. We keep recreating it. And how do we do it? And what's the nature of that spiritual transformation? Well, I believe that there's three, and I could be wrong, so welcome argument, pushback on this, but I feel like there's three critical groups or communities for the emerging movement. And the first one is formerly incarcerated people and people who have been most directly impacted by the system. As I said earlier, I don't think there's any chance of us changing our consciousness collectively if we don't ever treat those who've been demonized as real human beings and hear from them, hear their stories, engage with them in a meaningful way on equal terms, not as we're here to give you charity, or we're here to help you, or we're here to represent you, or you're our client, but we are working with you as equals, as partners. To me, there's no hope. We will never, as long as we're treating that population that we've labeled as thugs, felons, criminals, gangers, whatever label you want to, as folks who are just needing of our help, or people who are demonized and are unworthy of our care and concern, rather than human beings who have something to teach us and to contribute, and that they can be leaders in this movement, we're just going to keep doing this because we're going to keep believing that they are somehow less than, either needing our charity or worthy of disposal. So I view formerly incarcerated people and people who have been most directly impacted as critically important. Then young people. I feel like young people are, the young folks have been the spark and the energy that has driven, this wave of public attention that has, been focused in the last, few months on our system. And historically, it has always been young people who have refused to accept the status quo, who have been willing to, engage in great sacrifice and not play business as usual. And so I think we need to acknowledge that young people, I've had difficulty with some of the civil rights leaders basically saying to young people, will just get behind us, get with the program. I think we really need to be acknowledging that young people have a critical perspective, a critical voice, and that we should be making way for their leadership and doing what we can to support the emergence of young people in this movement. And then the last critically important group, I would say, is faith communities. For precisely the reason that was identified, which is that, at bottom, I view the crisis of mass incarceration not just as a policy failure, but a moral and spiritual crisis of enormous dimensions. And if we fail to reckon with that this is a profound moral and spiritual crisis, and if people of faith do not, really grapple with our complicity by our silence, the fact that we have remained silent for the most part over the last few decades as a system of control has emerged that's predicated on denying to God's children the very forms of compassion, forgiveness, and opportunities for redemption that we claim to cherish. If we don't acknowledge our complicity and begin to develop new theologies that will help to sustain a human rights movement that honors the dignity and humanity of us all, no matter who we are, where we came from, what country we came from, or what we may have done, I don't think the kind of cultural transformation that needs to happen will ever occur without that acknowledgement of the moral and spiritual dimensions and real leadership on behalf of faith communities, acknowledging complicity and pointing the way towards new theologies. Oh, John Legend. Sorry, John Legend. John Legend, it was interesting because I'm often very skeptical of celebrities in general. No, but I think, but actually, I am hopeful. I think that John Legend has his heart absolutely in the right place. I think he's trying to figure out how best can I contribute to this movement? And he was in Washington, D.C. Recently doing an event that was hosted by Politico, and he also visited juvenile detention centers and did performance in juvenile detention centers. He's been inside prisons, meeting with prisoners. He was in San Quentin just recently. He's not just doing things for the cameras. He's doing a lot that is completely out of the public eye. And when I went to the event in D.C., the folks who were running his campaign pulled me inside and said, you know, we just really want you to be clear that we are absolutely committed to wrestling with and addressing the racial dimensions of this, and that we also don't want our campaign or our work simply to revolve around nonviolent offenders, that we think that all folks who have been swept up into the system are worthy of care and concern, and we want you know, to be working for real change that will reach them too. And so I was impressed by, you know, the limited interaction that I've had so far, and I think it can be very difficult for people like John Legend, who are now removed in many ways, to figure out how to navigate this space and make the kind of contribution. But from what I can tell so far, his heart is in the right place. He's doing a lot far away from the cameras that I think is really worthwhile.
We're going to have to wrap up there because we want to have some time for Michelle to sign some books outside and greet some people. I do want to just say, I wanted to have you say a few words to all of us who are gathered for the next several days. There's about 100 of us here from across the country. And to sort of ground our work, I think this has been an incredible starting point. And what... if you could just sort of leave us with some words as we're investigating, as we keep investigating this issue deeper, sort of just a message, I guess, for us as we're continuing the conference.
Not just investigating, but organizing.
Yeah, all I can say is that I hope that, you know, in the hours that remain in this gathering, that we really take seriously the question of what does it mean to build a nonviolent revolution against injustice, one that will, you know, break once and for all our nation's history and habit of creating these caste-like systems. That, you know, for me, it's been a journey and a transition from being sort of a liberal civil rights lawyer, working at the ACLU, having my eyes opened to realities that I should have known and that were hidden in plain sight, to really beginning to see the necessity of us beginning to think of ourselves not as reformers, but as revolutionaries, people who are finishing and renewing revolutions that were begun years ago. You know, when our country was founded with the words, you know, all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights, there was a revolutionary spirit as well as an unconscionable compromise, right? Not only in terms of slavery, but also in terms of gender. But that revolutionary spirit, which certainly isn't just unique to America, but can be found in communities and cultures all over the world where people want to be free, who want to have the chance for their children to have opportunities and education and to live in safe communities. That revolutionary spirit isn't unique to America. We're not exceptional in that regard. But that revolutionary spirit, I think, is the spirit we have got to hold on to. It's the spirit that, you know, animated abolitionists. It's the spirit that animated, you know, freedom fighters during the civil rights movement. And it's that revolutionary spirit we have got to keep alive today and renew in our own heart today, not just in theory, but in practice. And so I would hope that as we move forward, we begin to have those difficult conversations of what does it mean today for us individually and collectively to think in terms of building a nonviolent revolution that will transform our political systems as well as end this history and cycle of creating caste-like systems in this country. So thank you so much for having me here today.
Let me whisk you outside so you don't get stopped.